we find that before Yosef, who's the youngest from the youngest of the brothers, passes away, he adjures his brothers that when they leave Egypt in the future and their remains are going to be taken out of Egypt, they should remove his remains together with theirs. He should not be left behind. And just as each one of the tribes of that particular individual took out the remains of their antecedent, the Jewish people should take out his remains. Although there were two tribes who descended from Yosef, Ephraim and Manasseh, he put the onus of removing his remains upon the Jewish people. Why did he put it upon the Jewish people? Originally, who had sold him into slavery from Canaan to Egypt? The brothers. So initially, the number of the Jews were 12. There were 12 brothers. And they went and they took one of them and displaced him. So he said to them, since initially my location was Canaan, and you displaced me by sending him into slavery, when we return to Canaan, it's your responsibility to bring me back to where I originally was. Therefore, he did not put the onus on his family, on his children, but rather he put it on all of them because they're responsible to return him to his origin, to his location of origin, which is Canaan. Okay? And that was a prerequisite for what? For the redemption. The Jews cannot leave Egypt unless the remains of Yosef were taken, because he adjured the brothers that they should adjure their families that they cannot leave unless they meet this prerequisite of taking the remains of Yosef back to Canaan. The Torah makes it a point, before he left Egypt, the Jews had an obligation to borrow the personal effects of the Egyptian, the wealth. As it says, kesef klizov, the silver and gold objects, vessels, and we borrowed. And the Egyptians lent us happily, okay? While the Jews were preoccupied borrowing the wealth, taking the wealth, which they knew was for keeps, what was Moshe doing? Moshe understood that unless he finds the remains of Yosef, they're not leaving Egypt. And he had no idea where to begin. It was one descendant who lived hundreds of years. It was Yaakov's granddaughter. Her name was Serach Bas Osher. And why did she merit such long years? And although she was a cousin, she was not an aunt. She was called Doda Serach, Auntie Serach. Why? Because when they wanted to break the news to Yaakov that Yosef was alive, Yaakov was no youngster. And they were concerned that the shock could actually affect his health. The level of disbelief, because he believed he's been grieving for 22 years, believing he's not alive. All of a sudden now, he hears he is alive. So they told Serach, who had a beautiful voice, and she went with her harp, and she made a song to share with her grandfather that Yosef is alive. And gradually it settled in. And because of that, she accommodated her grandfather and was sensitive that it should not bring him into a state of shock. He blessed her, she'd live long years. And because she lived long years, this blessing, she lived hundreds of years. So she remembered when Yosef passed away exactly how the Egyptians disposed of his remains. What did they do? They went and took a lead casket, put him into it, it weighed tons, and they sunk it to the bottom of the Nile. And they figured if over the years, with all the silt accumulating on top of this coffin, Yosef can never be retrieved. So she told Moshe, he's at the bottom of the Nile. How do you bring him up? We're talking you don't have salvage teams. How do you raise Yosef? And we're talking about this casket weighs tons. It's a crypt at the bottom of the Nile with everything just gathering on top of it for hundreds of years since he passed away, nearly 200 years. Moshe Rabbeinu goes to the Nile and he says, Yosef, and he takes a piece of pottery. We find that Yosef is compared to an ox, Bechor Shor. And he writes on its shore, and he takes the piece of pottery, throws it into the Nile, and he says, Yosef, we're here to fulfill our obligation. You adjured us to take you out of Egypt when we leave. We're ready to leave. You're welcome to come, and we will take you. But if you don't come, it's your choice not to come, and you will not be a hindrance into our leaving Egypt. All of a sudden, this humongous casket made of bronze or lead floats to the top. Moshe takes the casket, opens it, takes the remains of Yosef, and now the Jews are ready to go. And the Torah makes it a point. Vayikach Moshe Satzmos Yosef. We're talking about 600,000 males above the age of 20 and others above the age of 60. The only one who was preoccupied with locating the remains of Yosef was Moshe. What happened to the rest of the Jews? So the Gemara tells us, cites a verse in Mishlei, in Proverbs, Chacham lev yikach mitzvos. Only the one who has a wise heart, he takes the mitzvah. All the other Jews, they didn't have that level of wisdom. So what were they preoccupied with? Gathering the silver and gold. But what's the good of all the silver and gold? If you're locked in, you can't leave Egypt, because there's a prerequisite. The only way you're able to leave Egypt, only if you meet that prerequisite. You have to take the remains of Yosef out. The only one who thought of it was Moshe. But understanding it's so crucial to the redemption, why was Moshe the only one who attended to it? And Torah makes it a point. And King Solomon refers to him as Chacham Lev. He had that wise heart. Because the one who has the wise heart, he's the one who takes the mitzvah. The others did not have the wisdom of the heart. That's the question. Expression, seeing is believing. When you see something, that's real. When you understand something, as much as you understanding, whatever level of clarity you achieve, it's still in the abstract, it's not reality. Okay? When Chazal tell us, if you want to identify what is a wise man, Ezeu Chocham Haroas Hanolad. Who is the wise man? The one who sees the future ramifications of whatever is happening at this moment. It doesn't say who's the wise man, the one who understands the ramifications, the one who sees it. A person who has sage wisdom, it's not he understands. He knows. He knows because that's his reality. Because he sees. He sees it. I always give the example. The person sends his son to Harvard Business School, graduates with honors, comes back. His father built a business, 50 years, very successful business. His father's well-weathered in every type of transaction, business transaction. The son wants to, based on what he learned, to bring new business into the company. And he brings a proposal. And the son says to the father, I think if we go and do this deal, it's going to put us on a new level of success. So the father says, of course, show me the proposal. The father, he puts the proposal on the father's desk, and the father looks over his bifocals, and he looks at the deal, and there's a waste can next to his desk. He just pushes it into the waste can, falls into the waste can. So the son says to the father, Dad, you know, I've spent these years, I know what a good deal is. Why did you just brush it into the waste can? You barely paid attention to it. He said, son, I want to explain you something. I've been through the thick and thin of this business. I just have to glance on it. And if you want to take our business down, you do that deal. He says, but Dad, how do you know? He says, I could smell the deal. The deal is a disaster. Explain it. Either you see it or you don't see it. It'll take time for you to understand. That is the wise man, the one who's well-weathered, he sees. It's disastrous. There's no way you go. That's not an approach. If you have 600,000 men above the age of 20, what's the likelihood of all those, nobody's going to attend to the needs to take out the remains of Yosef? It's literally impossible. Nearly impossible, but it's possible. If you see the reality of what it is, you leave nothing to chance. Moshe, who had sage wisdom, he had the wisdom of the heart, as he's depicted by King Solomon in Proverbs. He's Roas Hanolat. He sees. What he sees, he leaves nothing to chance. Everybody says it's going to be taken care of. How do you know? How could it not be taken care of? How do you know it can't? It doesn't mean it will. Therefore, the Torah makes it a point. The only one who took out the reins, who addressed this need, was Moshe Rabbeinu. V'yikach Moshe es atzmos Yosef. Because he had that clarity. Now, there's an expression, penny wise, pound foolish. Person does the penny deal, misses on the pound deal. Why did Moshe have that level of clarity and the rest of them didn't? There's a mitzvah. There's a mitzvah to borrow gold and silver, and every Jew left with 10 pack animals laden with gold and silver. Tremendous wealth. They stripped Egypt clean. They fleeced them. Here we're talking about slaves. They have nothing. And now they have an opportunity to leave with wealth, one of a kind of wealth. It's a mitzvah. So now you have a mitzvah here. Either wealth or locate the remains of Yosef. And if we don't locate it, we're not leaving. How could it not be taken care of? You understand? The reason why you people don't have that level of clarity because you have a little bit of a conflict, because you have an interest in the material. Moshe Rabbeinu, who's negated totally to God, the material only has value only if it facilitates God's will. But over here, what will bring about God's will in the ultimate level? Taking out the remains of Yosef. Therefore, Moshe, who had the wisdom of the heart because it was who he was, because he himself, his heart was fully dedicated to God, and there was no sense of self. He was selfless. Therefore, he had that level of clarity. Therefore, he had the wise heart, and therefore he took the mitzvah because he understood which was primary and which was secondary, relative to one to another. Tell you a story. I'm not going to mention the name. There was a certain person, famous Holocaust survivor, author, and he was even on the president's panel of the Holocaust. I'll tell you what his name is, Elie Wiesel. And he once shared with me, I once walked with him at a distance in Israel, that after the war, he was in Paris. And he had a genius type mind, Elie Wiesel, and he was a great intellectual. And in Paris, there was a certain philosopher. I'm not sure if he was a Jew or non-Jew. And they were there for a year or two, because all the survivors, that's what many of them went to Paris, whether it was the Sorbonne, I'm not sure where. And he took this philosophy course under this professor. And the professor was like top of his game in philosophy. And Elie Wiesel was taken by this professor. And he had a friend. Elie Wiesel came from a very observant Hasidic family. Came from a town called Sighet in Hungary. And there was another person, his name was Menashe Klein, who became a leading Torah sage within a certain context of Torah sage, who was a good friend of his. And the question is, do we remain in Paris and continue this area of study, philosophy, under this great philosopher, or do we leave and go where we should go and go back to our roots and study the Talmud and become accomplished in that area. They become a bona fide Talmud Chacham. Menashe Klein became great Rabbi Klein. He authored Torah works. Eli Wiesel stayed behind. Eventually became a newspaper correspondent for the Israeli Mariv. He was a foreign correspondent, took a whole different direction. Rabbi Klein had a community. He built the yeshiva. He had a special family of observant, committed Jews. That was Eli Wiesel's situation. And Eli Wiesel told me, this story goes back maybe 8 years ago when I was walking. He says, I regret that I stayed. I should have gone with Rabbi Klein. We were childhood friends. I should have gone. But you can't turn the clock back. But I'm telling you, I should have gone. So what happened? He was so impressed with the intellectualism of this professor, he didn't see the forest from the trees. You have a mitzvah, gold, silver, unlimited amounts of wealth, that until now you have nothing. And you have a mitzvah, locate the remains of Yosef to take it out of Egypt, otherwise we're not leaving. How's it possible? With so many hundreds of thousands of Jews, you mean no Jews can attend to it? Probably. Somebody will. But probably is not definite. So that conflict of interest, of wealth, doesn't allow you to see it clearly. Moshe Rabbeinu saw it absolutely clear. He saw it because Moshe Rabbeinu is negated. The wealth has no value. All that has value is what is the word of God, what his dictate is. And if his dictate is we have to leave, the only way it's guaranteed we're leaving is if I locate the remains of Yosef. That's why Moshe had the wisdom of the heart. The others, it was slightly colored. It was tainted. And because it was slightly off, it didn't process it as it should have processed it. Ask the question.
When the Israelites were between the sea and the Egyptian army, Hashem goes to Moshe and asks him, why are you crying to me? You don't need to pray now. Yeah, why are you praying to me? It's time to
tell
move.
them to travel.
Right. So how come Moshe didn't understand that situation there?
Okay. Firstly, that has nothing to do with him not being negated to God, to be negated or not negated. This is what it's all about. The Rechaim HaKodesh explains over there that after all the Jews had seen and witnessed, I mean, how do you speak so badly out of turn? Are there a lack of graves in Egypt? Did we have to come die here? I mean, after God, all that God did for you, they think he's going to let you die here. Therefore, it was literally unforgivable. Now, when you pray to God, what is the basis for prayer? Why does God even is attentive in a way to respond? It's all based on the attribute of rachmim, of mercy. Because there's enough reason that you shouldn't be responded to. Because we're worthy of mercy. Because the Jews spoke so out of turn, they forfeited the right to mercy. So they had to prove themselves to God that you're willing to sacrifice on his behalf no matter what. Therefore, Moshe prayed because he believed they're worthy of mercy. God says they're not worthy of mercy. They have to prove their belief in me. They have to prove their faith in me. Therefore, they have to travel straight into the sea. But how can you travel in the sea? You're going to drown. They have to demonstrate that faith, that if I say travel, you travel no matter what. That's how strong the faith has to be. So therefore, Moshe praying is not a failing in Moshe. It's only an evaluation. He thought they were still worthy of rachmim, and Hashem says they're no longer worthy of mercy. Therefore, they have to prove themselves to reinstate themselves to be worthy of God's mercy. Shmuel, do you get it? After we left Egypt, there were the clouds of glory, which led us out of Egypt. After we left Egypt, and it says a pillar of cloud led us during the day, and a pillar of fire led us at night, illuminated the way. Now, the clouds of glory engulfed us, protected us, besides leading us. So the Medrash says, Hashem holech lifneim. Why did God lead us? Whatever measure we measure out, God doesn't kind, measure for measure. God always rewards or punishes measure for measure. Avram, Liva, Malach Hashoris. After Avram hosted the angels, it says he escorted them out of his home. Shenema Avram holech imam l'shalchom. Avram, after he hosted them, he walked with them to send them off. Lefichov Liva Kodesh Baruch Hu as born of Bamidbar Arboim Shana. Therefore, God escorted us for 40 years in the desert. He was with us, escorting us, taking care of us for 40 years. Avram Yukach no. Avram provided water. We had the wellspring of Miriam for 40 years. Now this is beautiful. Hashem holech lifneim yomam. You know, God is the creator. If you want the Jews to be escorted and led, the creator himself should be the one to lead them. God permeates all existence. The world is filled with his glory. So what does it say? Hashem holech. But yet God is escorting us. Lodia. What is God saying to the world? It's to inform the world, Chibas Yisrael Lifnei Umos. To what degree God loves the Jewish people, and he wants it to be known before all the nations of the world. That God himself is leading us. That the world should treat us with the utmost respect. If God himself is showing us, according us this accommodation, the Creator is leading us, so how should the world treat us? How should they acknowledge us? Also with the greatest level of respect. Not only did they not treat us with respect, but they subject to the most extreme levels of death. They torture us to death. Rather than the takeaway should be to revere us and to honor us, the takeaway from Hashem, they kill us with the most severe level of death penalty. Therefore, it says at the end of time, coming of Mashiach, he says, I will take all the nations and bring him to the valley of Yehoshaphat. This is in Israel. I will judge them because of my people and my portion, the Jewish people, who are strewn among all the nations through the exiles. It doesn't say they're going to be punished because of the three cardinal sins. Because of what they did to my people and to my portion, who are the Jewish people. Therefore, there will be a level of judgment not to be understood. Egypt will be desolate. The Edomites, which were still in the middle of that exile, they're going to be a desolate desert. There's not going to be a trace of their glory, of their vibrancy. Yehuda is the leadership, that's kingship. They will be established then forever. And Jerusalem will be from generation to generation. It will never be destroyed again. And I will vindicate their blood. I will avenge their blood. A Mosai, when is that? Hashem Shochem Tzim. When God will dwell in Zion, that's when what? That's when all this is going to happen. When God's ready to take us back to Zion, he will judge the world for what they did to us. And they can't say, we didn't know. If God himself leads us and shows the world who we are and puts us on that pedestal, how do you think you should treat us? But rather than learning from that takeaway, they did to the contrary. They tortured us, they killed us throughout history. They dispersed us throughout the nations. You read about what they did to the hostages, the way they mistreated them, the abuse. It's not to be believed. subhuman behavior, the level of cruelty, inhumanity, it's not to be believed. Festival of Sukkos, we find that we bring 70 oxen, 70 bulls. Each ox corresponds to one of the 70 root nations. And why do we bring these communal offerings on behalf of the 70 nations of the world? Because all the sustenance, all the bracha that comes into this world, which provides for them, it comes as a result of those 70 oxen, which correspond to each one of the 70 root nations. So Rabbi Yochanan says, not only did they not appreciate the value of the Beis Hamikdash, of the temple, and what it provided for them, and understanding that they should have encircled it with thousands and thousands of legions of soldiers to protect it, because that's that nest egg. That's the Fort Knox. So not only did they not do that, they sent thousands of legions of soldiers to decimate and destroy it. Similar to what we're talking here. You'd say there they didn't appreciate it. But here, this is undeniable. When God led us, the light shone that all the way throughout Canaan, they saw this light. And they said, what is it all about? They said, that's the God of Israel leading them. So if the God of Israel values them to such a degree, how do you think you should treat them? But yet they were oblivious to it. And they behaved as if they saw nothing. No, there's no innocence here. There's no basis. There's no wiggle room out of culpability and liability here. And ultimately they will be judged because of that. Speak about the 7 wonders of the world. A person goes to Victoria Falls, I think it's in South Africa, near South Africa. It's one of the 7 wonders. Niagara Falls doesn't compare to it. If you go there and you see it, it's breathtaking. You never saw anything like it. When the sea split, the Yam Suf split, and the water cascaded vertically, where all the nations of Canaan were able to see the water. They saw the splitting of the sea. And here the Egyptian armies are pursuing the Jews, and the Jews are passing through the walls of water. What does the Torah tell us? They just kept going. Don't you think they should stop for a moment and say, this is something unbelievable. Nothing of this nature has happened since the beginning of existence. Don't you think they should have taken pause to make an evaluation? Should they go further? Not go further. They went head first. Not even noticing. How do you not notice? There were 250 miracles that took place at the sea. The seas of the miracles of Egypt pale to this. I mean, how do you not, somehow, how are you not touched by this? But evidently they weren't. They went straight in. So you say, God hardened the heart of Paro. He hardened the heart of his subjects. But after hardening, that's only you see things irrationally. But if you see something which you never saw before, how do you not take pause and stop for a moment and say, maybe we should rethink this? There was no hesitation. Why? That's the question. Anybody who's been exposed to these classes over an extended period of time, and you have a secular education, there's nothing comparable in terms of its profoundness, its truth, its depth and breadth, and the amount of information, and yet people won't give it the time of day. Not the time of day, not to consider it. Not you're going to change your life, not even to consider to listen. So if the Egyptians went into the sea It is the first event of this dimension ever taking place. They didn't even notice it. That's part of the answer. But how do you not notice it? They didn't notice it. You'd say, because they were singly focused. They had tunnel vision. All they saw was the Jews, because they took their personal effects. We got to destroy them. We got to bring them back. And a person can be so singly focused, you notice nothing but what you want to notice. And everything is irrelevant, even the splitting of the sea. That's how strong the conflict of interest could be. Give you an example. We find that when the angels left the home of Avram, where did they go? 2 of the angels went to Sodom. What happened in Sodom? Lot notices these 2 wayfarers. Immediately, he offers his hospitality. But you realize in Sodom, hospitality was a cardinal sin. It was punishable by death. So immediately they become aware that Lot is hosting guests. And they knock on the door and say, Lot, we got a problem here. You're doing something which is illegal. So he pleads with them. This is my honor. If you want, you can take my daughters and rape them. Just leave my guests alone. And then the angels, they pull them back in the house, they close the door. And now they want to break the door down. There's every male from young to old. They surround the house. They want to attack the house and break the door down. To be able to take hold of these guests and sodomize them, then kill them. Hear what's going on. So what did the angels do? They smite them. They all become blind. From the youngest to the oldest, they all became blind. And it says, even in the blind state, they were groping to locate the door to get into the house. You know what it means? A person could see, and all of a sudden you lose your vision, God forbid. You're like taken aback. You become non-functional. Don't you think for a moment, losing your vision should rattle you to say, maybe, I should rethink this. Even in the blind state immediately, they didn't stop. We want these people, we're going to sodomize them. But you're blind. What do you need to wake you up? The answer is if people are so evil and so bent, and they're so opposed to hospitality, and they see it as an evil, they don't see the light of day. The light can be shining brightly, they do not see the light of day. That's how tunnel vision a person could be. The Egyptians had one thing in mind, to bring back the slave class, to bring back our wealth. They didn't even notice the sea splitting. They only noticed this, nothing else. Sometimes you're in the airport and somebody's speaking on his phone. And they're speaking so loud as if nobody else is around. And it's disturbing everyone. We don't have to be privy to his nonsensical conversation. But this person is speaking as if he's in his own private room. So the question is, how could he have such a lack of consideration? Not being sensitive, and people are being upset. You know what the answer is? A person who has no consideration, he can have thousands of people around him. It's like nobody's around him. He doesn't consider anybody. All that matters is himself. It's like people are not there. That's the way he lives his life. A person who is not considerate to any degree, all that matters is me. Everybody else is irrelevant. But how is it? Because that's the way the person is wired. It's me, nobody else. That's the reality of people. That's the quality of people, unfortunately.